But the thing that is more important than ever before, it was important 10 years ago, it's going to be even more important in 10 years from now. And that is the agility of learning. Because literally, again, it sounds obvious, but it's so true. No one knows everything. And the smartest person in the room, they're going to be absolutely outcompeted by a system of others that collaborate and learn and adapt and test and all of that stuff. Why don't we convene a roundtable of CEOs and talking about leadership and their stories? And we took 4 or 5 CEOs from the book, brought them to the New York Times. I was there, and we had this kind of virtual leadership thing. It was a front page thing. It promoted the book. The book was a big bestseller. And then, it's like this win-win-win stuff of learning, sharing, and then developing relationships.
Jim, it's so good to see you again.
Great to see you, Bob. Happy 2025.
Well, I'm very honored to have you on, and thank you so much for joining. You and I go way back to college days and our first job after together.
That's right. September 7th, 1981. We started
That was it.
Our first day at Morgan Stanley together.
You don't think anybody's doing the math on this, do you?
I know, we're old, but at least we feel young.
Well, it was fun watching your first 10, 15 years of career because you had lots of twists and turns, and I look forward to talking a little bit about that. But all of a sudden, you were a senior person at Spencer Stuart, and you were on, multiple books that wound up being best-selling business books. And it's a story that ought to resonate with a lot of people because it's loaded with learning at each stage, identifying what you love to do, realizing that that's pretty much a secret to success, and, spotting opportunities and putting in the extra work to make new things happen. You've not only helped a lot of companies hire their leaders, but you've also helped countless individuals rethink their careers and achieve their own potential. I want to explore some of your insights on career breakthroughs and corporate performance and how the executive world has evolved. And maybe at the end, we can talk a little bit about what we should be looking for in the future as companies evolve. But why don't we first start? Tell us a little bit about Spencer Stuart and then how your career began.
Thanks so much, Bob. It's really fun to have this conversation and to share some of the insights that I and my colleagues here at Spencer Stuart have learned over the years, because we're in the business of leadership. And what started as a pretty niche business years ago, this firm, Spencer Stuart, is one of the worldwide leaders in executive recruitment, CEO succession, leadership advisory. It's kind of all things people and leadership. The industry started about 70 years ago as an outgrowth of the management consulting industry. Firms like McKinsey and Booz Allen at the time, what they would do is they would develop strategies for companies, and oftentimes they required new leadership to go and implement the strategies. So they created these in-house executive recruitment activities. But then about 65 years ago, there was a sense that, no, there needed to be like an independent, sort of like audit firms and consulting firms needed to be independent. So firms like Spencer Stuart, Russell Reynolds, Heidrick and Struggles were founded. And today we're one of the largest, and we believe the best, in the CEO and board leadership, recruitment, and leadership advisory space. We're about $1 billion private firm with 250 partners in offices all over the world. And it is the greatest business if you really like leadership, people, careers, having an impact on clients and companies, and through new CEOs when it works really well, which in our case, we're very proud of many of the huge success stories. It really impacts shareholders and employees and stakeholders in a really dramatic way. So it's great. And I lead our CEO and board practice here at Spencer Stuart, and I have the privilege of working across industries, from financial services to media and technology, healthcare, consumer, not-for-profit, financial services, and the like.
That's fantastic. Now, how would you leave college and wind up in a job like that?
Today, interestingly, we have a great program for college grads to come into the firm as analysts, kind of modeled after the investment banking and management consulting analyst programs. We hire off of the best colleges around the world, and they come in, and some go back to business school, some lead and go do other things, but some then get promoted to associate and principal and partner and all the like. But when I started, it wasn't quite as evolved as that I had, as you alluded, and as you personally well know, a very circuitous path into starting at Spencer Stuart 25 plus years ago, and with a lot of good stuff, but a lot of pretty bad mistakes.
Good learning.
Yeah, good learning, exactly. Yeah, we all know it. No one likes to make mistakes. No one likes to lose, but we all do. And the question is, what do you learn from them? And then how do you apply it going forward? That's obviously one of the big skills in life, but also in career management.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Truflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Truflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at truflation.com. Well, we both were analysts in the training program, or not really training program, but at Morgan Stanley. It was a fun area of the firm, and we both went back to business school. So you're in business school, and tell me about the job seeking that you did at the time and what ensued.
So as you went to Yale School of Management, I went to Harvard Business School, and it was a great experience. In fact, I just taught a class there just last week on this exact same topic, and it was just, I loved it. It was, I have to admit, it was terrifying because people are so incredibly smart and articulate, and the nature of Harvard Business School is all about class participation and making comments in a pretty high-pressured situation. So you have to learn how to communicate in a group setting, which is a life skill which we developed then and took to this day. But interestingly, many of the people there were really either nervous or terrified about interviewing. And to me, that was always more of a sport because I found it pretty easy to instinctively know what interviewers were looking for. And then I just knew how to engage with the person, essentially understand what they were looking for, and piece together pieces of my experience to try and fit what they were looking for. So essentially be the answer to their problem. And so I interviewed across businesses, a lot of finance and investment banking and investing world, but also in management consulting, a little bit of corporate, big not-for-profit, the World Bank. And I had this knack of getting pretty advanced in all of these interview processes. Again, well, a lot of my business school colleagues, who I promise you were so much smarter than me, they were having some more trouble. I just had all these opportunities. And here's where I made, I'll say, my first big mistake, and then the learning that ensued. So being 25 or 26 at the time, and being in the kind of analytical part of my life in business school, I set out making criteria. What did I want from my job coming out of business school? And I wanted to make a lot of money. I wanted to have a reasonably balanced lifestyle, and I wanted it to work in a prestigious organization. So money, lifestyle, prestige. I recognize it's not kind of mission driven, and I'm being really honest again, as you know. And against those three criteria, I had lined up all the different options. And the one that was the top ranking on those dimensions was Goldman Sachs Private Wealth Management. Great money and opportunity there. Goldman Sachs, super prestigious. And unlike M&A or some of the banking stuff we did before business school, it was tied more to the market. So I thought that was more reasonable. So I started at Goldman, and it was a training program, and the people were great, but I realized that I neglected two important things. Number one is it's really helpful to be interested in the actual substance of the work. You've always been a great investor and love the markets. I never was a good investor, and I actually don't really like the markets. And so everybody at Goldman and Private Wealth, they were like they were market geeks. You know this. My cubicle mate that back then, as an associate at Goldman, was Jim Cramer of Mad Money fame. And Jim, who, by the way, was the editor of the Harvard Daily, he was a great writer, but he was a genius investor. And he loved taking Goldman Sachs research reports and writing newsletters. He was a great writer. And he sent out memos to the clients talking about, his interpretation of that. And I was thinking, like, I couldn't do that because, I had no feel. And that's what made someone great. He obviously went on to, in the dot-com boom, he left Goldman and created the street.com, which essentially did what he did there as an associate before going on to CNBC fame. So there were a lot of other great investors there. So I didn't like investing. And the other thing I didn't really like, and I didn't realize that was a core part of the job, was selling, in the sense of cold calling. Someone sells a company and everybody's trying to become their private wealth advisor, and like making those cold calls. I found it kind of terrifying, to be honest. So I didn't like it. And after a year, I left and I went to McKinsey in management consulting, where I'd interviewed and gone the whole way the prior year. And I spent 5 years and I loved it there. And there were lots of lessons there too. But that was the first lesson, that the criteria you pick for your decisions is really everything. And prestige is actually not a great criterion. Substance of what you're working on and culture fit and the people. Lifestyle's really good and important. Money is important and all of that. It's important to be honest with yourself. But people and substance are really even more important.
I had a very similar experience at the time, as you recall, and I joined a group and I just knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be lending money to people who bought companies. And so the number one company was GE Capital, and I was dying to get there, and I got the job and I was thrilled. And the three people that I liked the most said, I think it was like the third day I was there, we're all leaving and we're going to an investment bank and we're going to be doing leverage buyouts for the investment bank. And we really want you to come along. And they were the main reason I joined that group, because of the people. And I put people way down the list, and I put the organization and, what they did at the top of the list. Not the best decision. I should have joined those guys.
I mean, seriously, from when it comes to careers, the one thing that's most important, literally the most important, is people. And you're working with people all the time. And if you like and respect them, you'll be somewhere between fine and amazing. And you can have the best job, the best everything. But if you're working with people who you don't like, or they don't like you, or there's no respect there, bad fit, it's going to be miserable. So that's really the single most important thing in guiding career decisions.
So you went to McKinsey and then you decided to make another move.
And here was another lame move I made. One of the industries that I worked at McKinsey, which I loved, was media. And this was now the early 90s. And I really wanted to go into the media industry. One of my business school section mates and best buddies was the chief financial officer of Disney at the time. He was only 31. He was CFO of Disney. And he was telling me about all the cool stuff they were doing. I was like, oh, that sounds so cool. And I had this creative streak that actually, ironically, manifested itself much later, but just was attracted to that. I didn't want to move from Connecticut and the New York area. And again, I used some criteria, and I went to a company which at the time was a very well-run, well-regarded company, the Reader's Digest Association. At the time, it was the largest publishing company in the world. They had gone from private to public. Goldman Sachs took them public. It's worth about $6 billion. And the president was a McKinsey client of mine. And it was only, 15-minute drive from my house in Stamford, Connecticut. Beautiful campus. Reader's Digest at the time had the world's most valuable art collection in this beautiful bucolic campus in Chappaqua, New York. And the founders of Reader's Digest, Lila and DeWitt Wallace, back in the early days of the 20th century, they supported Impressionist artists, and they had, like, the boardroom was filled with Monets and Cézannes all the place. And I was like, wow, what a beautiful environment to be set in, kind of like a college campus. So I went to Reader's Digest as director of strategic planning, which is logical coming out of 5 years of McKinsey. But here was the big mistake there. Two mistakes. One, other than the president, who was a great client, I didn't really pay a lot of attention to the cultural fit. And I felt like a fish out of water after being at Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and McKinsey in a very kind of professional services, everybody super motivated with kind of a career tracks that were pretty clear. To go into a corporation, it was like a completely foreign act for me. And I had no kind of feel for how to operate in a corporation. And the cultural fit, there was just, I didn't really have a lot of friends there. So I missed the people part there. But the third thing, which is embarrassing to admit, but I'll admit it to you because it's just us on this podcast, is I was a pretty lousy strategist. I mean, as an example, I mean, I'll kid you not. I think I've told you this story. So this was 1993, and it was the earliest days of electronic publishing, and the internet was about to blossom. My responsibility was to develop an electronic publishing strategy for Reader's Digest. And I went and I did some research, and I met with other media companies. And there was one, my colleague at another media company called Ziff Davis at the time. She was like, Jim, she goes, this is the best opportunity in the world. What we're doing is there's this thing called the internet. I was like, what's that? She said, it's this electronic community where we're going to put all of our content online, and we're going to have subscriptions, people able to access all of our titles. You guys should do the same. And I literally didn't understand what she was talking about. And I completely misled. Well, the recommendation was to go into the CD-ROM publishing business and create like a catalog. It was terrible. I realized, I'm not particularly a great strategist, so I was pretty miserable. And I called a friend of mine who was the office manager of Stamford office of Spencer Stuart, a great woman named Claudia Kelly, a real leader in our firm. And she had been at McKinsey too prior to going into executive recruiting. And I told her how kind of unhappy and unsuccessful I was. And she said, Jim, I have an idea for you. Have you ever thought about our business? And I was like, headhunting? And she said, yeah. She said, it's all the good about McKinsey without any of the bad. And I was thinking, that sounds pretty good. So that started lots of interviews that I had, and I really liked the people. I really liked the substance. I really liked the culture, and I liked what was going to be. And so but I did know, this is again, I was 33 years old, that this was not like a means to an end. It wasn't like do this to get something else. I really viewed it, I have to get it right because there's kind of no off ramp. Turns out later, there are plenty of off ramps, talent partners, other kinds of things. But so I went in, and thank goodness I was so lucky. Literally from that first day, from the first week, I absolutely loved it. And it's been a 30+ year love affair ever since.
Yeah, it's a profession in that sense where you just keep doing what you're doing and you refine it and you get good at it at the time. And then later, all of these new industries popped up from the expertise that people developed by understanding the recruiting business, right? I mean, even the coaching business came.
Yeah, that didn't really exist back then. But I'll tell you, the big breakthrough for me, and I take this to this day, was, and this is a big lesson learned from McKinsey, which is at McKinsey, the best way that the firm, and it's not just McKinsey, but it's Bain and BCG and Accenture and others, they become thought leaders, and from thought leadership, they develop relationships and then business. So I had the opportunity to write an article back right as a new consultant for a magazine called Directors and Boards. And this is 1995. I did a study of the age demographics of American boards. And I saw that at that time, only 7% of public company board directors were under the age of 55. Today, it's close to 20%. And so I said, what would it be? What's a case for recruiting young directors? I was young and all that. So I went out and I interviewed a number of young directors, and I found a few things. Number one, people really wanted to talk to Spencer Stuart, and it opened all these doors. The process of doing that, I got that article published not only in Directors and Boards, but then in the New York Times. And people started coming to me as a,
Expert.
but yeah, as an expert.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I'd like to be on a board. And then I had this idea again, taking from the McKinsey days, I had this real just drive to write a book. I had this, and there was, again, you're a Dartmouth guy. One of my placements that year was a Dartmouth grad who had written a best-selling book on the internet. And I asked him, his name was Bruce Judson. He wrote a book called Net Marketing. And I placed him as a president of this cool internet company. And I said, Bruce, how did you write that book? And he said, and I said, how do you write a book? He said, I asked my Dartmouth English professor, how do you write a book? And he said something very memorable to me. He said, write the book you want to read. If the book you want to read hasn't been written, then that's the book you want to write. It's like, write the book you want to read. And I thought, what would be the book I'd want to read? So I had this just simple, powerful idea in 1997 to say the book I'd like to read is profiles of the best CEOs in America, kind of what their life is, what their careers were, what made them great, and then what are the lessons learned about leadership. And this is before kind of the Fortune Most Admired companies, the HBR top CEOs. It was before all those lists. And so, but it just struck me as such an obvious idea. And I went about and went through the whole publishing process and got this great book deal with Random House and put this thing together. And that was the breakthrough. In 1998, we came out with Lessons from the Top. And I had the chance to interview and meet amazing CEOs from Bill Gates to Jack Welch to Michael Eisner to Hank Greenberg and Howard Schultz and all these amazing people. And again, I learned about leadership, and it also provided this access that really supercharged my early career.
I would imagine, I think that the readership among CEOs of any size company must have been very high, and therefore you had lots of open doors and probably lots of incoming phone calls as well.
And we did all that's true. And we did all sorts of things that now anybody tries to do, but it was just like the idea so obvious was never done. And the other thing is I approached the New York Times where, again, I knew some people from my media work. And I said, why don't we convene a roundtable of CEOs and talking about leadership and their stories? And we took 4 or 5 CEOs from the book, brought them to the New York Times. I was there, and we had this kind of virtual leadership thing. It was a front page thing. It promoted the book. The book was a big bestseller. And then, it's like this win-win-win stuff of learning, sharing, and then developing relationships.
It's one of the best stories, career stories of all time, coming up with the idea of that book and having, noticing that it hasn't been written. Now, I had also a front row seat at how much time you had to spend. You have a regular job, and then you're writing a book and doing all these interviews. That must have been, it's one of those moments where you see an opportunity and you must think, how am I ever going to have the time to finish this?
That is true. That kind of stuff has to come from inside. One of my partners here at Spencer Stuart, a brilliant partner and colleague named Claudius Hildebrand, he just led a book that I've been heavily involved with. I'm not a co-author, but called The CEO Life Cycle, a brilliant book about looking at every public company CEO in America since the year 2000 and doing this stuff. Anyway, the point is that, like me back then, you have to just be driven to do this. You can't be assigned a task and do that. You really have to have that, just like your podcast activity. It just has to be something you want to do.
Yeah. No, I remember your weekends and nights. You're working all night. I got to get this draft done. You must have loved that so much that you went on to write a whole bunch of other books.
Well, the first one is the hardest. That is for darn sure. And then the second one, then the e-commerce boom happened, and the editor-in-chief of Strategy and Business magazine said, Jim, we love Lessons from the Top. How would you update it for the .com boom? And so I wrote this. I did a study of, just for an article, and did kind of leadership of e-commerce businesses and interviewed lots of people. and wrote this big article. I was a cover of Strategy and Business magazine. And then the publisher said, oh, we should expand that to a book. And then that happened. And then the next one, really, which was the bestseller of all time, one of your Dartmouth classmates, I was recruiting to be the CEO of a company. And he said, Jim, how do I get off to a great start in the CEO role? And I just said, I wrote him a memo over Christmas vacation, said, here's what I see, kind of common sense, but what I'd observed over the prior kind of 10 years of placements getting off to the right start. And that article, which I published on Yahoo Finance, where I was a contributor at that time, that got thousands or scores of thousands of reads and views. And I said, there's a topic there.
Yeah, and you just did that off the your memory. Now I can actually study the data and refine it and hone it and then give it a real title. And
the big learning there also, the difference between Lessons from the Top, which just studied the 50 best business leaders in America, what I learned though is that a lot of the learning is the contrast between the best and the worst. And so for this first 100 days book, I said, why don't we study the best and worst CEO successions? And I literally said, what are the 100 best and worst? And went out and did case studies and that became that book that called You're in Charge, Now What? Which has sold like 500,000 copies and it still goes. And the principles of how to get off to a great start in a new role, I did it kind of for CEOs, but it's applicable to everyone starting a new leadership job. And so anyway, that's been a thread through my career of learning, contributing, because you know what? Everyone wants to learn in an interaction. And if you have something beyond what you're just working on in that moment, because everybody says, what are you working on now? And you can talk about your kind of core stuff, but you say, well, I'm doing this cool research project on X. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. And, people like to learn through these interactions.
Your career spans the time and you had a technology focus. So you were front row seat at the changes in the economy and changes in management and changes in careers. If you look at how economic growth has occurred, it seems that in the last 2 decades, and especially maybe in the last 5 years, the pace of change is accelerating. Your own industry, and you've been on the management committee of Spencer Stuart for a very long time, and your industry is probably a pretty good example of how things change fundamentally and how you have to constantly innovate and stay ahead. What are some of the challenges that Spencer Stuart has gone through? Because these days it seems like you've got an even stronger position than you did before all these changes began to happen. And what are some of the lessons that are applicable and similar to other industries?
At the risk of sounding trite, and I really don't want to do that, this notion that we all know that things change, everything changes, and then how you adapt to the change and test things out and learn from them. In our particular industry, one of the huge changes has gone from the definition of our industry from an executive recruitment firm, where a company needs a CEO, either they have to remove the CEO for performance reasons, or there's health reasons, or they don't have a successor, so they call a firm like Spencer Stuart. That was the core business. But about 20 years ago, well, I guess it started after Sarbanes-Oxley in 2004, but particularly in the last 15 years, boards have gotten much better and much more focused on CEO succession planning. And then that cascades down. CEOs and chief human resource officers are trying to think about succession planning. So if our business was going to thrive, we had to get beyond recruitment into the leadership advisory business and into the succession business. I'll give you a couple of numbers. So in the United States, over the last 25 years, about 80% of CEOs are promoted from within. So think about that. 80%. So if our business is defined as kind of the leading CEO firm, 80% is promoted from within. Then if you're only a recruitment firm, you're only operating and competing for 20% of the market. And average turnover in the S&P 500 is about 12 to 15% a year. So that's about 60 CEO appointments a year. And if 80% of those are promoted from within, then it's only like 12 big CEO searches a year. And sure, those are front page of the Wall Street Journal and all that. But that's a pretty tiny slice of business. Again, we're a $1 billion firm. So about 15 years ago, we really launched a CEO succession practice, which is the market leader in that. And boards have gotten very good at that. And there's a whole state of the art in advising boards and working with boards on defining the future leadership requirements for the company. That's kind of the spec. That's the anchor. Assessing and developing internal candidates, because most boards promote from within. Most boards want to promote from within. And then even if you have internal candidates, what is the market and the potential market for external talent? So benchmarking them and then doing that over time. Many of these boards start doing succession planning 3, 5, 7 years before CEO transition. So it becomes more like an advisory business. And then if you need to activate an external track, then we go into that core search business and we do the whole advisory around that. So that's one example of how we've changed as a firm, looking at how the market has changed. But I will tell you that, I mean, we think it's kind of complicated and all that, but compared to being a CEO and running a company in a hugely dynamic and changing market, that's where it really is hard. And I will tell you that the core skill set of a CEO, it's not different than before. There's leadership, and I can give you a summary of what I believe the core skills that differentiate great CEOs are. But the thing that is more important than ever before, it was important 10 years ago, it's going to be even more important in 10 years from now. And that is the agility of learning. Because literally, again, it sounds obvious, but it's so true. No one knows everything. And the smartest person in the room, they're going to be absolutely outcompeted by a system of others that collaborate and learn and adapt and test and all of that stuff. It really is something very well known and applied in technology, but it's now across every sector, including not-for-profits and college and university presidents. No one has all the answers. So it means that someone has to really be open to the input of others, facilitate great collaboration, take the input and make better strategies, and then bring people along to drive it forward.
Looking ahead, and it is cliche, as you pointed out, but it is also true that things are changing rapidly, and it does seem that they accelerate and change even more rapidly going forward. As we look forward, do you have any insights into whether the concentration of business activity is likely to increase or decrease? It feels like the tools available to small companies and individuals to actually compete and create competitive threats has never been greater. Do you have a sense if that all means things are going to get better faster, and are companies going to maintain their position? How do you look at the future from what you see about talent development and corporate development?
I look at it as a bit of a barbell situation. You know, my son Teddy's a venture capitalist, and he and his partner Weston are doing incredible work with early stage companies. And so I'm very focused on that. And I see early stage companies scaling much more rapidly, getting massive valuations, but going to revenue and very large revenues much more quickly than ever before. And just look at some of the fastest growing companies, whether now it's, an Airbnb in hospitality or Ramp in financial services, they do have access to technology, to web hosting it with AWS, with the ability to attract great talent earlier and get massive momentum. And they don't have the core, let's call it legacy business, that they have to debate, or the investor expectations to try and manage. Yet on the other end of the barbell, you have the gigantic companies and the Magnificent Seven in technology, and larger getting larger, and the scale the ability to invest in innovation because you have larger scale. So the bigger challenge is kind of everybody in between. And the leadership implications of that are really massive. I really believe, and we studied this back at McKinsey, I really believe the hardest business challenge for a leader is if you're in a pretty successful core business or even a cash flow generative business that might be mature or even declining, and you have investors who are expecting the cash flow from that business, but they know what they have to do, but how do you actually grow a new business at the right pace while cannibalizing your old business and managing that? A couple of the companies that I admire most who have done that brilliantly are Adobe, Intuit, and other companies like Schlumberger in the oil services business. They have these core businesses. I mean, Netflix obviously is a brilliant example. They didn't get so hooked on the red envelope kind of DVD business, but they knew that there was going to be a shift. But if you're the CEO of Adobe, Shantanu Narayan, he started when he was president, then CEO. They had a business model that was on shrink wrap software, licensing basis. And he knew that they needed to go into the SaaS business and go subscription and to manage that profitability decline in order for it to grow. But it's one of the great value creating stories in the world. And Intuit did it, and some companies did. That to me is much harder than founding something from scratch, making it work, and getting massive valuations.
And artificial intelligence just happens to be the buzzword for the last 6 to 12 months, if not more. How is this going to be a technology that is deployed and accelerates change?
I'm sure you have other guests who are much, much more expert on AI than me. I will just tell you this, that it is becoming a key part in the CEO profiles that we're working on across industries. One of the CEOs who I'm very proud to have led the recruitment for is for Pearson, the world's largest education and learning company. And education and learning is one of the industries being disrupted by AI. And Omar Abash was a member of Satya Nadella's leadership team and quite expert on AI. And that's one of the key reasons why he became the successful CEO, and he is guiding them into that. I'm doing a big, global financial services CEO search right now where AI is absolutely a part of the key criteria, because how they create tools and products for their investor clients, it's all about leveraging AI. Worked with another big global information services company that used to be a publishing company, then became a digital company. Now it's an AI company that's gone from a 10 or 12 billion market cap to 100 billion market cap company because they're leaning in. So it is true across healthcare. We're doing a massive healthcare project, and how that works, both internal operations, but in how it creates opportunities for customers. So it's something, again, I don't know that much about it. I use it like everybody else, but it is definitely something that is across industries right now.
It really does look like a productivity enhancer that should be able to help the global economy grow faster and more efficiently.
Certainly the optimist case, which I do subscribe to.
Jim, it is so great to see you again. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating.
Thanks, Bob. Really enjoyed it. Hope some of the pieces help your audience make great career decisions and think about leadership in the biggest way, because I will just close on this note. I'm really a big believer in leadership, and no matter what happens with AI or technology or the structure of the economy or socio-political developments, the impact that any individual leader can have on a large group of people has never been greater, and therefore it's more important than ever.
Excellent. Jim, thanks so much.
Thanks, Bob.
If you like this video, please hit like, subscribe, and leave any comments you might have. You might also want to check out some of my other interviews. We try to dig into the problems that make Americans so pessimistic about the next generation, but we also interview people whose work doesn't get the headlines, but they make life better for society every day. Given humanity's steady progress over the last 275 years, it's likely that there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspectives on today's challenges and opportunities.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com.